An employee of the reptiliarium decides to do a frightening act, releasing a poisonous snake to bite a black boy. But what happened afterward came as a surprise to everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The day started like any other at St. Anne's Shelter for Children, a modest institution housing kids of all ages, each with their unique stories and dreams. The shelter wasn't much to look at, but it was home for a number of young children who had been displaced from their families or had nowhere else to go. Its rooms were narrow, the paint on the walls had started to peel, and the cafeteria served simple yet nourishing meals. But for the children, it was a place that offered some sense of stability and comfort. Among the kids, a boy named Jeremy stood out. Jeremy was small for his age, with a spark of curiosity in his eyes and a contagious excitement that could lift the spirits of the other kids. He was known to be chatty and observant, often sharing little facts he had learned or imagined about the world outside the shelter. The other kids loved him for his endless supply of stories and his ability to turn even the most mundane aspects of their lives into something magical. Today, however, was anything but mundane. The shelter's staff had just announced that they were planning a field trip for the children to the local wildlife sanctuary, a special outing in honor of Halloween. For Jeremy, this was nothing short of a dream come true. "We're going to a sanctuary," he whispered to his best friend Michael, his eyes wide with excitement. "Do you think they'll have snakes?" Michael, a bit older and more reserved, looked at Jeremy with a small smile. "Probably. But why would you want to see snakes? They're creepy." Jeremy's face lit up even more. "Because they're not creepy. They're amazing. Did you know some snakes can smell with their tongues?" Around them, other kids were abuzz with their own conversations, speculating about the animals they might see. The air was filled with laughter, curiosity, and that special kind of energy that only children could radiate when they were genuinely excited about something. For Jeremy, animals were a fascination that bordered on obsession. His fascination had begun with a television show he'd seen in the shelter's common room. The documentary had shown him a world of creatures he had never seen up close: reptiles, birds of prey, exotic mammals, and other animals he only knew from books. From that moment, he had dreamed of seeing them for real, and now that dream was about to come true. The shelter staff, led by Mrs. Callahan, the head caregiver, began organizing the trip. She had been working at St. Anne's for over a decade and had a reputation for being both compassionate and strict. Her deep care for the children's well-being meant she left nothing to chance. As the day of the trip approached, she gathered her fellow caregivers to discuss the itinerary and ensure the safety of all the children. "Everyone needs to be vigilant," she said sternly, looking over her staff. "These kids don't get out very often, and we want this to be a good experience for them. The sanctuary has strict rules, and some of the animals are dangerous if not treated with respect. We need to keep a close watch on everyone." The other caregivers nodded, fully aware of their responsibilities. For them, the children were more than just wards. They were almost like family. Each child had a different story, a different background, but all of them had been through some form of hardship. This trip was more than a field trip. It was a rare chance for these kids to experience something outside the four walls of the shelter. One of the caregivers, Mr. Ellis, voiced a concern. "I've heard the sanctuary staff aren't always the most welcoming. I mean, especially when it comes to kids like ours." Mrs. Callahan's face clouded for a moment. She understood what he meant. Children from the shelter were sometimes met with suspicious or dismissive attitudes. She had seen it before. the way people would look at her kids as if they were troublemakers just because they came from a shelter. But she was determined not to let that spoil the experience. "We're going, and we're going to make sure the kids enjoy every moment," she replied firmly. "We'll stay close to them, and if anyone gives us trouble, we'll deal with it. Our kids deserve this experience just as much as anyone else." The caregivers spent the next few days preparing the children for the trip. They explained the sanctuary's rules, emphasizing the importance of respecting the animals and following instructions. The children listened intently, their anticipation growing with each passing day. Jeremy was particularly eager. Every night before bed, he would talk excitedly with Michael about the animals they might see. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon, even the more skeptical children began to share his excitement. To them, this trip wasn't just a chance to see animals. It was a break from the routine of the shelter, a glimpse into a world beyond their own. Finally, the day arrived. The children gathered in the common room, bundled in their coats and scarves, their eyes sparkling with anticipation. Mrs. Callahan and the other caregivers made sure everyone was accounted for and loaded onto the small bus that would take them to the sanctuary. As the bus pulled away from the shelter, the children cheered, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, the weight of their past seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of adventure and possibility. The ride was short, but filled with energy. Jeremy sat by the window, pressing his face against the glass as he watched the city fade into trees and fields. He could hardly contain his excitement, pointing out every bird and tree he recognized to anyone who would listen. The bus was alive with chatter, the children's voices blending into a joyful hum. When they finally arrived at the sanctuary, the children stared in awe at the entrance. The sanctuary was larger than they had expected, with towering gates adorned with images of various animals. As they filed out of the bus, the caregivers reminded them to stay close and follow the rules. But Jeremy's mind was already racing, imagining the creatures waiting for him just beyond the gates. As they entered, they were greeted by one of the sanctuary's staff, a tall, stern-looking man named Jack. His gaze swept over the children, and Jeremy felt a shiver run down his spine. Jack's expression was unfriendly, his posture rigid, as if he were more interested in maintaining order than sharing his love of animals. He barely looked at the children, focusing instead on addressing the caregivers. "Let's keep things under control," he said curtly. "We have animals here that don't respond well to chaos." Mrs. Callahan nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. She sensed his hostility, but she refused to let it spoil the day. With a warm smile, she turned to the children and encouraged them to follow the sanctuary rules, assuring them that they were in for a memorable experience. Jeremy felt a surge of excitement as they began their tour. The sanctuary was everything he had hoped for. Cages filled with exotic birds, enclosures housing creatures he had only seen in books. His fascination grew with each stop, his eyes lighting up as he absorbed every detail. However, Jack's cold demeanor lingered in the background, casting a subtle shadow over the experience. He guided them through the exhibits, but his interactions with the children were limited to barked orders and sharp glances. Jeremy noticed the way Jack looked at him and the other kids from the shelter, a look that seemed to dismiss them as troublemakers before they had even done anything. The caregivers kept a close watch on the children, reminding them to stay close and follow Jack's instructions. They were aware of the tension in the air, but they focused on keeping the children engaged and excited, determined to make this day a positive memory. As they moved deeper into the sanctuary, Jeremy's excitement only grew. He was captivated by the animals, his mind filled with questions he wanted to ask. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's watchful gaze was always on him, a silent warning that told him to be careful. Little did Jeremy know that this sense of unease would soon turn into something far more dangerous, a dark twist to a day that had started with so much hope. The bus rolled to a stop in front of the sanctuary's main entrance, a high archway decorated with intricate metalwork that depicted various animals in a natural scene. To the children from St. Anne's, this entrance symbolized a doorway into another world. The sanctuary grounds stretched far beyond what they could see from the gates, giving them a first glimpse into the mysteries it held. As they disembarked, their voices filled the air, a mixture of awe, excitement, and impatience to get started. Mrs. Callahan gathered the children around her, reminding them once more of the rules they had discussed. "Remember," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we're here to learn, but we also need to respect the animals. Stay with your groups and listen carefully to the staff." The children nodded, their eyes wide with anticipation. Jeremy clutched his friend Michael's sleeve, whispering, "This is going to be amazing. I wonder what we'll see first." But as they approached the sanctuary doors, Jeremy noticed a man standing nearby, watching them with an unreadable expression. He was tall, with a stiff posture, and wore the sanctuary's uniform, though it somehow looked less welcoming on him. His name tag read Jack. Jeremy sensed something cold in his gaze, something that made him feel both small and out of place. Jack's expression was neither friendly nor curious. It was dismissive, almost irritated, as though their group was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. Mrs. Callahan noticed Jack too and gave him a polite nod. "Good morning. We're here for the group tour. The children are very excited." Jack barely acknowledged her with a nod. His eyes skimmed over the children, pausing momentarily on Jeremy, and his mouth set into a thin, disapproving line. "Follow me," he said curtly, his voice flat. "Let's keep things calm. The animals don't respond well to noise." The kids instinctively fell quiet, their excitement somewhat dampened by his tone. Mrs. Callahan gave them a reassuring smile, silently urging them to focus on the animals rather than their grumpy guide. She whispered to the other caregivers, "Let's just keep an eye on him. He doesn't seem too thrilled to have us here, but we won't let him spoil the day." Jeremy's initial excitement returned as they began their tour. The sanctuary's first exhibit was an aviary filled with exotic birds from around the world. Bright colors flashed through the trees as parrots, cockatoos, and other species swooped above their heads. The children gasped and pointed, laughing at the birds' playful antics. Jeremy leaned as far forward as he could, eyes wide with fascination. "Did you know some parrots can live to be over 100 years old?" Jeremy whispered to Michael, who rolled his eyes but grinned. "Here we go again," Michael teased, nudging him. But Jeremy couldn't contain himself. This was the closest he'd ever been to the creatures he'd seen only on screens or in books. They moved from the aviary to the mammal enclosures, where they saw lemurs, a lazy anteater, and a group of monkeys swinging from branches. The caregivers watched as the children pressed against the glass walls, enthralled by the animals. Mrs. Callahan felt a surge of pride and happiness, seeing the kids so genuinely happy and engaged. However, each time they moved to a new exhibit, Jack's cold presence lingered behind them, his eyes scanning the children, particularly Jeremy, with an almost disapproving intensity. When some of the younger kids began to get noisy, he snapped at them. "Quiet down," he barked. "You'll upset the animals." The children immediately fell silent, some looking visibly intimidated. Mrs. Callahan stepped forward, her tone kind but firm. "Jack, we'll remind the children to stay calm. They're just a little excited. It's their first time seeing animals like this." Jack gave a curt nod but said nothing. As they moved to the next area, he maintained his position at the back, watching them in silence, his expression tight and unwelcoming. Despite Jack's presence, Jeremy was determined not to let anything ruin this day. Each new enclosure was like a portal to another world, each animal a miracle. He asked questions at every stop, sometimes directing them to Mrs. Callahan or Mr. Ellis if Jack seemed particularly unapproachable. Jeremy's enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the other children were joining in, eagerly pointing out details and sharing their observations. Finally, they reached the reptile pavilion. This was the part Jeremy had been waiting for. As they entered, a distinct earthy smell filled the air, and the room was dimly lit, creating a cool, shadowy atmosphere that was both eerie and thrilling. Tanks and glass enclosures lined the walls, housing everything from small lizards to large pythons. Jeremy's eyes immediately locked onto a tank in the far corner, where a coiled snake lay under a heat lamp, its scales gleaming in the light. He moved closer, practically pressing his face against the glass. It was a rattlesnake, its body thick and muscular, its patterned skin a blend of sandy browns and grays. "Look at that one," Jeremy whispered to Michael. "Isn't it amazing?" Michael shuddered. "I don't know, Jeremy. It looks pretty dangerous." Jeremy just smiled. To him, it wasn't just an animal. It was a symbol of nature's power and beauty, something to be respected and admired. He barely noticed Jack approaching from behind, his gaze focused intently on the snake. "Careful there," Jack said, his voice low but filled with a strange, almost mocking tone. "You might get closer than you bargained for." Jeremy felt a chill run down his spine. Jack's words didn't sound like a friendly warning. There was something unsettling about the way he'd said it. But before Jeremy could respond, Jack gestured for him to move on. The group continued through the reptile pavilion, observing various species of snakes, lizards, and even a few turtles. Mrs. Callahan tried to lighten the mood, sharing facts about each animal and encouraging the kids to ask questions. But Jeremy couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's gaze was following him, as if waiting for an opportunity to catch him in some minor infraction. As they moved toward the final section of the pavilion, Jack stepped forward and looked directly at Jeremy. "You seem pretty interested in snakes," he said with a hint of something that wasn't quite friendliness. "Would you like to see one up close?" Jeremy's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? Could I?" Mrs. Callahan immediately sensed something was wrong and stepped forward. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jack gave her a dismissive wave. "Of course. I'll make sure he doesn't get too close." Despite her misgivings, Mrs. Callahan didn't want to dampen Jeremy's enthusiasm. She nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on Jack, her body tense, ready to step in if necessary. Jack led Jeremy to a smaller tank near the back of the pavilion, this one holding a rattlesnake, similar to the one Jeremy had admired earlier. The snake was coiled near the front of the tank, its eyes fixed on the approaching figures. Jack leaned in and tapped the glass lightly, drawing the snake's attention. Jeremy, unaware of any danger, leaned in as well, mesmerized. Jack shot a quick glance over his shoulder, ensuring that none of the other caregivers were too close, then reached subtly toward the latch on the tank's lid. "Be careful," Jack said in a low voice, his eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "Sometimes these guys get a little jumpy." At that moment, he released the latch, allowing the lid to lift slightly. Before Jeremy could react, the snake struck, its fangs sinking into his arm. Time seemed to freeze. Jeremy's scream shattered the silence, and the other children turned in horror as he stumbled back, clutching his arm. His face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror. The caregivers rushed forward, their expressions filled with panic and disbelief. Mrs. Callahan knelt beside Jeremy, frantically searching for the bite marks. "Call an ambulance!" she shouted to Mr. Ellis, her voice breaking with fear. Around them, the children huddled together, their faces pale and frightened. Jack stood back, his expression unreadable, his hands folded behind him. Mrs. Callahan looked up at him, her eyes blazing with accusation. "What happened?" she demanded. Jack shrugged, his tone indifferent. "It was an accident. I warned him to be careful." But Mrs. Callahan wasn't convinced. She could see the faint smirk lurking at the corners of his mouth, the satisfaction in his eyes. She turned back to Jeremy, her heart pounding as she tried to keep him calm, whispering words of reassurance even as fear clawed at her. The other caregivers managed to call for help, but the delay felt endless. Jeremy's breathing grew shallow, his skin turning pale as the venom began to spread. The sanctuary staff, alerted by the commotion, arrived too late to offer any real assistance. As they waited for the ambulance, Mrs. Callahan held Jeremy close, her mind racing with anger and suspicion. She knew that what had happened was no accident, but proving it would be another matter. The panic spread quickly through the sanctuary's reptile pavilion, shattering the quiet ambiance with cries and whispers that bounced off the stone walls. Jeremy lay on the floor, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain as he gasped for breath. Around him, the other children backed away, their faces pale and their eyes wide with shock and fear. Mrs. Callahan knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his shoulder, desperate to do something, anything, that would ease his suffering. "Jeremy, stay with me," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Jeremy's eyes were filled with terror as he looked up at her, his breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps. The venom was already beginning to take effect, causing his arm to swell and his skin to turn an alarming shade of pale. His fingers twitched involuntarily, and he fought back tears as pain radiated up his arm and into his shoulder. The other caregivers, led by Mr. Ellis, were trying to keep the rest of the children calm, ushering them away from the reptile enclosure and back toward the main entrance. Some of the younger kids were crying, their frightened sobs echoing through the pavilion, while others simply stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sudden and horrifying turn the day had taken. Mr. Ellis glanced back at Mrs. Callahan, his face pale. "The ambulance is on its way. They said it could take a few minutes." Mrs. Callahan nodded, though her mind was racing. Every second felt like an eternity as she watched Jeremy writhe in pain. She looked around the room, desperate for any kind of first aid, but the sanctuary staff had yet to offer any help. Jack stood off to the side, his expression cold and detached as he observed the chaos around him. He showed no sign of concern or regret, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched Jeremy with an almost clinical detachment. It was as if he were studying the scene rather than feeling any empathy for the child he had deliberately put in harm's way. Mrs. Callahan met his gaze, her eyes blazing with anger. "What were you thinking, letting him get that close?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. Jack shrugged, his tone indifferent. "I warned him to be careful. He didn't listen." "That's a child you're talking about," she shot back, her voice rising. "A child you encouraged to lean in close, and now he's been bitten by a snake." Jack raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Accidents happen," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "Maybe you should teach your kids to follow instructions." Mrs. Callahan clenched her fist, her hands shaking as she struggled to hold back her anger. She wanted to shout, to scream at him, to demand that he admit what he had done. But Jeremy's whimper of pain brought her back to the present, and she forced herself to focus on him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Jeremy," she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're strong. You're going to get through this." The sanctuary's other staff members finally arrived, though none seemed to be prepared for an emergency of this nature. They whispered amongst themselves, casting uneasy glances at Jack, as if they weren't sure whether to approach or leave him alone. One of the staff members, a woman in her early 30s with a kind face, stepped forward, visibly shaken by the sight of the injured boy. "We have a first aid kit in the main office," she offered, her voice hesitant. I can go get it." Mrs. Callahan looked at her, desperation clear in her eyes. "Please, hurry." The woman nodded and hurried off, leaving Mrs. Callahan alone with Jeremy and the other caregivers, who had managed to keep most of the children at a safe distance. Jeremy's breathing was becoming more labored, and Mrs. Callahan could see the fear in his eyes as he struggled to stay calm. "Stay with me, Jeremy," she whispered. "Help is coming." Jack continued to watch from a distance, his face impassive. Mrs. Callahan caught his eye, and, for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something in his expression, a hint of satisfaction, a smugness that made her stomach turn. She knew in that instant that he had done this deliberately, but proving it would be another matter. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the woman returned with the first aid kit, kneeling beside Mrs. Callahan as she opened it and began searching for supplies. She handed Mrs. Callahan a packet of gauze and antiseptic, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the kit. "Thank you," Mrs. Callahan murmured, pressing the gauze against Jeremy's arm, though she knew it would do little to counteract the venom. It was a small comfort, a way to show him that he wasn't alone. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, and a wave of relief washed over Mrs. Callahan. She kept her hand on Jeremy's shoulder, whispering words of encouragement as they waited. The other caregivers gathered around, their faces etched with worry and anger, casting dark glances in Jack's direction. When the paramedics finally arrived, they moved quickly, assessing Jeremy's condition and administering emergency treatment. Mrs. Callahan stepped back, watching as they loaded him onto a stretcher, her heart pounding as she realized just how close they had come to losing him. The other children were huddled together, their faces pale and their eyes wide with shock. Some of the younger ones were crying, clinging to each other for comfort. Mr. Ellis and the other caregivers did their best to console them, though they too were shaken by the incident. As the paramedics prepared to take Jeremy to the hospital, Mrs. Callahan turned to Jack, her eyes blazing with fury. "This was no accident," she said, her voice low and steady. "You know that as well as I do." Jack raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You should be more careful with your accusations," he said coldly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Callahan's hands trembled as she fought to keep her composure. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that he take responsibility for what he had done. But she knew that now was not the time. Jeremy needed her, and she couldn't let her anger distract her from what mattered most. As the ambulance pulled away, Mrs. Callahan and the other caregivers gathered the children, doing their best to reassure them. They promised that Jeremy would be okay, that he was in good hands, But the children's eyes were filled with fear, and Mrs. Callahan knew that the day's events would haunt them for a long time. As they led the children back to the bus, Mrs. Callahan glanced over her shoulder, her gaze locking onto Jack. She saw the faint smirk that flickered across his face, the satisfaction in his eyes, and she knew that he had intended for this to happen. But what he hadn't counted on was her determination to hold him accountable. The drive back to St. Anne's shelter was silent, heavy with the lingering shock of the day's events. The children sat huddled together, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. Even the ones who hadn't directly seen the snake-bite Jeremy were deeply shaken, their excitement from the morning replaced by a new, more unsettling feeling. Mrs. Callahan sat at the front of the bus, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what had happened. She could still see the look on Jack's face, that faint, mocking smirk that hinted at something darker. She clenched her fists, her stomach churning with anger and suspicion. The way he had dismissed her concerns, the way he had encouraged Jeremy to get closer to the tank, it all pointed to something more than just negligence. But she knew that proving it would be a different challenge entirely. As the bus pulled up to the shelter, the other caregivers began helping the children off, whispering comforting words and guiding them inside. The children's footsteps echoed softly in the hallways as they filed into the common room, where the familiar surroundings provided a small measure of comfort. Mrs. Callahan stayed behind, watching each child with a protective gaze, her heart heavy with worry. Once the children were settled, she gathered the caregivers in her office. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them struggling to process what they had witnessed. Mr. Ellis, usually calm and composed, looked visibly shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he took a seat. "What happened back there?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mrs. Callahan took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It wasn't an accident," she said firmly. "I know it wasn't. Jack was watching Jeremy the whole time, practically goading him into getting closer to that tank. And when the snake bit him," she paused, clenching her fists, "he didn't even flinch. It was like he'd been waiting for it to happen." The caregivers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words settling over them like a dark cloud. They had all seen Jack's demeanor, his dismissive attitude toward the children, but to think he would do something so deliberate, something so cruel, was difficult to accept. "What can we do?" one of the younger caregivers, Miss Thompson, asked hesitantly. "I mean, he didn't exactly leave any evidence, did he?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. "No, but we can't just let this go. Jeremy is still in the hospital, and the doctors said he'll need time to recover. We owe it to him to make sure this doesn't happen again." Mr. Ellis nodded, his face set with determination. "We should report it, at the very least. If there's a record of this incident, it might prevent him from doing something like this to another child." They spent the next hour discussing their options, finally deciding to file a formal complaint with the sanctuary's management. They knew it was a small step, but it was the only option they had at the moment. Mrs. Callahan hoped that, with enough pressure, the sanctuary would be forced to investigate Jack's actions and possibly remove him from his position. The following morning, Mrs. Callahan prepared the complaint, detailing the events of the previous day and emphasizing Jack's suspicious behavior. She included statements from the caregivers who had been there, each one corroborating her account of his demeanor and the way he had acted before and after the snake bite. She made the call to the sanctuary's management office, her hands shaking slightly as she waited for someone to answer. When a receptionist finally picked up, Mrs. Callahan took a deep breath, recounting the details as calmly and clearly as she could. The receptionist listened politely, though her tone remained impersonal, almost robotic. "We'll look into it," the receptionist said dismissively, as though Mrs. Callahan had reported a minor inconvenience rather than a serious incident. "Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Mrs. Callahan gritted her teeth, fighting back the frustration bubbling up inside her. "I hope you understand the severity of this situation," she said firmly. "One of your staff members endangered a child's life. This isn't something you can just brush off." The receptionist's tone softened slightly, but her words remained the same. "We'll conduct an internal review. That's all I can promise at this time." When Mrs. Callahan hung up, she felt a surge of helplessness. She knew that an internal review likely meant nothing would change, that Jack would continue working at the sanctuary without facing any real consequences. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done, that she needed to find some way to hold him accountable. Over the next few days, as Jeremy recovered in the hospital, Mrs. Callahan began to reach out to the local community, hoping to draw attention to the incident. She shared a brief statement on social media, detailing what had happened and urging other families to be cautious when visiting the sanctuary. She didn't name Jack directly, but she made it clear that a specific staff member had been involved. The post quickly gained traction, with parents and community members expressing their outrage and support. Some shared similar experiences they had had with rude or unprofessional staff at the sanctuary, while others voiced their concerns about the safety measures in place. Within hours, the post had been shared dozens of times, and local news outlets began reaching out to Mrs. Callahan, eager to learn more about the story. When a reporter from the local news station called, Mrs. Callahan took a deep breath, knowing that this was her chance to make a real impact. She recounted the events of that day in detail, emphasizing the lack of accountability she had encountered when she tried to report the incident. The reporter listened attentively, asking questions and promising to follow up with the sanctuary's management. The next day, an article appeared in the local newspaper titled, "Child Endangered at Local Sanctuary, Negligence or Malice." The piece detailed the incident, highlighting Mrs. Callahan's concerns and the lack of response from the sanctuary's management. The article quickly circulated, drawing the attention of even more community members and sparking a wave of outrage. Under mounting pressure, the sanctuary's management finally issued a public statement. They expressed their regret for the incident and assured the public that they were conducting a thorough investigation. However, their statement was vague, lacking any concrete details or promises of action. Mrs. Callahan felt a bitter sense of disappointment. It was clear that the sanctuary was more concerned with protecting its reputation than addressing the real issue. Despite the sanctuary's lukewarm response, Mrs. Callahan wasn't alone in her fight. The community continued to voice their support, many parents expressing their fears and frustrations about the sanctuary's lack of transparency. Some families even canceled planned visits, unwilling to risk their children's safety. Meanwhile, Jeremy's condition had improved, and he was finally able to return to the shelter. His arm was still bandaged and he moved with a slight limp, a reminder of the trauma he had endured. But his spirit remained unbroken. The other children greeted him with hugs and cheers, their relief evident in their smiles and laughter. Mrs. Callahan knelt beside him, her voice gentle as she asked, "How are you feeling, Jeremy?" He managed a small smile, his eyes tired but hopeful. "I'm okay, Mrs. Callahan, just a little sore." She nodded, her heart swelling with pride. Jeremy's resilience was remarkable, and she felt an even stronger resolve to see justice served. She knew that his experience would stay with him, that the memory of that day would linger in his mind. But she was determined to show him that he didn't have to face it alone. In the days that followed, more details began to emerge. Other visitors came forward with stories of their own, recounting uncomfortable encounters with Jack and other staff members who had shown little regard for safety or respect. Some parents even shared old reviews, claiming that their own children had been treated with coldness or indifference during their visits. The evidence was mounting, but Mrs. Callahan knew they needed more. She spent her evenings going through emails and messages, documenting each account and gathering statements from other families. Her resolve only grew stronger as she realized that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of negligence and discrimination. It was during one of these evenings that she received a call from the local police. They had seen the news coverage and were interested in speaking with her about the incident. Mrs. Callahan's heart raced as she realized that they were finally being taken seriously. She agreed to meet with them, hoping that this would be the breakthrough they needed. The meeting with the local police marked a significant turning point. Mrs. Callahan sat across from Detective Harper, a seasoned officer with a calm, focused demeanor. He listened attentively as she recounted the details of the incident, taking notes as she described Jack's suspicious behavior and the sanctuary's lack of accountability. Detective Harper's questions were precise, and Mrs. Callahan could tell that he was taking her concerns seriously. "What we're dealing with here, Mrs. Callahan, isn't just negligence," Detective Harper said, his voice measured. "There's a clear suggestion of malice, and if what you're saying is true, Jack's actions were premeditated." Mrs. Callahan felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone in authority was acknowledging the gravity of the situation. She handed Detective Harper a folder containing all the evidence she'd gathered: witness statements from caregivers, social media posts detailing other families' experiences with the sanctuary, and a copy of the newspaper article that had sparked public outrage. "Thank you for bringing this to us," Harper said, flipping through the pages. "I can assure you we'll investigate every angle. If there's any evidence of intentional harm, we'll make sure Jack is held accountable." Mrs. Callahan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The police involvement was more than she could have hoped for, and it meant that the sanctuary would no longer be able to sweep the incident under the rug. With a sense of purpose, she left the station, determined to see this investigation through. In the following days, the community rallied around Mrs. Callahan and the children of St. Anne's. Local activists organized gatherings outside the sanctuary, holding signs and chanting for justice. Social media was flooded with calls to action as people demanded transparency and accountability from the sanctuary's management. Parents who had once considered the sanctuary a safe place began to share their reservations, some canceling future visits altogether. Meanwhile, the media picked up on the story, with reporters eager to cover the growing controversy. News stations interviewed parents and community members, giving the story a platform that extended far beyond their small town. The sanctuary's reputation, once spotless, was now tainted by allegations of negligence and discrimination. Mrs. Callahan continued to work tirelessly, reaching out to families who had shared their stories online and gathering more witness accounts. Each night, she would compile the information, carefully noting any patterns in the complaints. A picture began to emerge, a culture of indifference, with staff members showing little respect or empathy for visitors, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds. Through these efforts, Mrs. Callahan discovered other disturbing accounts involving Jack. Families reported that he had often displayed a cold, dismissive attitude toward their children, making rude comments or ignoring questions. One mother recalled an incident where her son, who was also black, had been scolded by Jack for getting too close to an enclosure, even though other children had been standing just as close. It was clear that Jack's behavior was part of a larger pattern of bias. Under increasing pressure, the sanctuary's management attempted to control the situation by releasing a public statement. In it, they expressed their sincere regret over the incident and pledged to conduct an internal review to ensure that all safety protocols were being followed. However, the statement was vague, with no specific mention of Jack or the allegations of bias. To many, it seemed like a hollow attempt to placate the public without making any real changes. The community's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Parents, activists, and supporters of St. Anne's took to social media, criticizing the sanctuary for its lack of accountability. Some even organized a petition demanding Jack's immediate termination and a thorough investigation into the sanctuary's management practices. Within days, the petition had thousands of signatures, and local businesses began to withdraw their sponsorships from the sanctuary, unwilling to be associated with the negative publicity. Mrs. Callahan watched the response unfold with a mixture of relief and frustration. She was grateful for the community's support, but she knew that real change would only come if the sanctuary faced concrete consequences. She reached out to the families who had been affected, encouraging them to file their own complaints and add their voices to the growing outcry. One evening, as Mrs. Callahan was compiling another report of witness statements, she received a call from Detective Harper. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, his tone serious. "We found something that I think you'll want to hear." Her heart raced as she listened to him explain. The police had managed to obtain access to some internal records from the sanctuary, including incident reports and staff complaints. Among them, they had found several warnings about Jack's behavior, dating back over a year. Complaints from visitors, as well as from his own colleagues, had detailed his unprofessional conduct and his tendency to single out certain guests, particularly those from minority backgrounds. "There's a pattern here, Mrs. Callahan," Detective Harper said. "Jack's behavior has been an issue for some time, and it looks like the management ignored it. They had every opportunity to address his actions, but they chose to look the other way." Mrs. Callahan felt a surge of anger as she realized the full extent of the sanctuary's negligence. They had knowingly allowed Jack to continue working with the public, despite clear evidence that he posed a risk to their visitors. It was no longer just about Jeremy or the children of St. Anne's. It was about every family who had trusted the sanctuary to provide a safe environment. "Thank you for letting me know," she said, her voice steady. "Please keep me updated on any further developments." After hanging up, she took a moment to collect herself, then immediately reached out to the community members who had been supporting their cause. She shared the new information with them, urging them to continue applying pressure on the sanctuary. With each passing day, the movement for accountability grew stronger, and it was clear that they were on the verge of real change. Finally, the pressure became too much for the sanctuary's management to ignore. They scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Callahan, community leaders, and representatives from the local government, hoping to reach a resolution. The meeting was held at a community center, with members of the press and concerned citizens gathered outside, waiting anxiously for updates. As Mrs. Callahan entered the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just representing Jeremy or St. Anne's. She was speaking on behalf of every family that had been wronged. She took her seat across from the sanctuary's director, a man named Mr. Graves, whose expression was tense and wary. "Mrs. Callahan," he began, his tone formal. "I want to start by expressing our deepest apologies for what happened. We take these allegations very seriously, and we are committed to making the necessary changes to prevent this from happening again." Mrs. Callahan met his gaze, her expression unyielding. "With all due respect, Mr. Graves, an apology isn't enough. Your sanctuary knowingly allowed a dangerous individual to interact with the public despite multiple warnings. You put the safety of innocent children at risk, and now one of my children is recovering from a traumatic experience that could have been avoided." Mr. Graves shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such direct confrontation. "We understand that mistakes were made, and we're working to address them. Jack is currently suspended, and we're reviewing our hiring and training policies to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The response felt insufficient, a carefully crafted statement designed to deflect rather than take responsibility. Mrs. Callahan pressed on, refusing to let him off so easily. "Suspending him isn't enough. We need a full investigation, and we need to know that changes are being made at every level. This isn't just about Jack, it's about a culture that allowed someone like him to go unchecked." The room fell silent as Mr. Graves considered her words. Finally, he nodded, his expression one of reluctant resignation. "We're prepared to cooperate fully with the police investigation, and we'll be implementing new policies to address the issues that have been raised. Additionally, we'll be offering financial compensation to the families affected by this incident." The concession was a small victory, but Mrs. Callahan knew it was only the beginning. She stood up, her gaze unwavering. "I'll hold you to that, Mr. Graves, and I'll be watching to make sure those changes actually happen." As she left the meeting, a sense of resolve filled her. She knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time she felt that they were making real progress. The sanctuary's management had been forced to face the consequences of their negligence, and with the police investigation underway, she was confident that justice would be served. The weeks following the confrontation were a whirlwind of meetings, updates, and community actions. The sanctuary, now under intense scrutiny from both the public and law enforcement, moved quickly to implement new policies and address the growing list of concerns. News outlets continued to cover the story, interviewing parents, community leaders, and members of the police department. Each broadcast painted a clearer picture of a place that had failed to protect its visitors and a man who had gone unchecked for too long. Mrs. Callahan maintained close contact with Detective Harper, who kept her updated on the progress of the investigation. Harper had unearthed additional complaints and even discovered that several former staff members had left the sanctuary due to discomfort with the management's dismissive handling of safety issues. One former employee came forward, detailing a pattern of unaddressed complaints against Jack that spanned years. "This isn't just about negligence, Mrs. Callahan," Harper said during one of their updates. "It's about deliberate inaction. They had every opportunity to intervene, and they chose not to." With each new piece of evidence, the case against the sanctuary and Jack grew stronger. The police recommended formal charges against Jack for child endangerment and negligence, as well as charges against the sanctuary's management for failing to act on known issues. The community, buoyed by the momentum of the investigation, held regular gatherings to show their support for the children of St. Anne's and to demand accountability. Mrs. Callahan attended every one, feeling both pride and a fierce sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, Jeremy was recovering well, both physically and emotionally. After several weeks of medical care and counseling, he returned to St. Anne's, where he was welcomed with cheers and hugs from the other children. He wore a small bandage on his arm, a reminder of what had happened, but his spirit seemed unbroken. Mrs. Callahan noticed that he was quieter than usual, his gaze often drifting as if lost in thought. One afternoon, Mrs. Callahan found him sitting alone in the shelter's small garden, gazing at a butterfly that had landed nearby. She sat beside him, her voice gentle. "How are you feeling, Jeremy?" He looked up at her, a faint smile on his face. "I'm okay. Sometimes it feels like a bad dream, like it didn't really happen." Mrs. Callahan nodded, understanding the mix of confusion and fear that often came with trauma. "You're very brave, Jeremy. What happened was awful, but you're safe now, and we're all so proud of you." He nodded, his smile growing a little stronger. "I just hope no one else has to go through that." "You've helped make sure of that," she assured him. "Because of you, a lot of things are changing. You're helping keep others safe." Jeremy seemed comforted by her words, and over time she noticed his natural curiosity and enthusiasm returning. He began sharing his stories again, regaling the younger kids with tales of animals and adventure. In his own way, Jeremy was healing, slowly but surely. The sanctuary, under pressure from both the investigation and the community, took significant steps to address its issues. They hired an independent safety consultant to review their policies and ensure that all staff received comprehensive training. They also created a more robust system for handling complaints, allowing visitors and employees alike to report concerns without fear of retribution. One of the most significant changes was the sanctuary's decision to establish an educational outreach program for underprivileged children, offering them free admission and guided tours led by trained, empathetic staff. The program was named in honor of Jeremy, a gesture that Mrs. Callahan found both touching and bittersweet. While she appreciated the sanctuary's attempt to make amends, she knew that no gesture could erase what had happened. Still, the program served as a reminder that Jeremy's experience had led to positive change, and that his bravery had sparked a movement. As the investigation reached its conclusion, Jack was formally charged with child endangerment. The trial was widely covered in the media, with community members attending in support of Jeremy and the other children of St. Anne's. Mrs. Callahan took the stand, recounting the events of that fateful day with clarity and emotion. Her testimony, combined with the evidence gathered by Detective Harper, painted a damning picture of Jack's actions and the sanctuary's negligence. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching a verdict. Jack was found guilty of child endangerment and sentenced to probation and community service, along with mandatory counseling. While the sentence was lighter than some had hoped, it was a significant victory for Mrs. Callahan and the community. Jack would never work at the sanctuary again, and his actions would follow him wherever he went. The sanctuary's management also faced consequences. The board of directors made several changes, including the dismissal of executives who had been complicit in ignoring complaints. The sanctuary, once a beloved community institution, now carried a tarnished reputation. But Mrs. Callahan took comfort in knowing that her actions had led to real, lasting change. Several months after the trial, Mrs. Callahan received an invitation from the sanctuary. They were hosting an event to celebrate the launch of the educational outreach program, and they wanted her and the children of St. Anne's to be their guests of honor. She hesitated at first, unsure of how the children would feel about returning to the place where Jeremy had been hurt. But when she discussed it with them, they expressed a surprising eagerness to go, driven by a desire to see the positive changes that had come from their ordeal. The day of the event was sunny and warm, a stark contrast to the tension-filled day of their first visit. As they arrived at the sanctuary, they were greeted by smiling staff members, many of whom were new hires brought in as part of the sanctuary's reforms. The atmosphere was welcoming, a far cry from the cold, indifferent reception they had experienced before. Jeremy walked beside Mrs. Callahan, his eyes wide as he took in the familiar surroundings. He seemed both nervous and excited, his gaze darting around as if half expecting to see Jack lurking in the shadows. But instead, he saw friendly faces, staff members who greeted him with genuine warmth and respect. As the group made their way to the main stage, Mr. Graves, the sanctuary's director, approached Mrs. Callahan with an outstretched hand. "Mrs. Callahan, I want to thank you for everything you've done. You've made us a better organization." Mrs. Callahan accepted his hand, her expression serious. "I hope you understand that this wasn't just about one person, Mr. Graves. It was about ensuring the safety and dignity of everyone who walks through your doors." Mr. Graves nodded, a look of sincerity in his eyes. "We've learned a lot from this experience, and we're committed to doing better. The changes we're making are just the beginning." The ceremony began, and Jeremy was invited on stage to help unveil a new plaque dedicated to the sanctuary's educational outreach program. The plaque bore his name, a testament to his bravery and the impact his experience had made. Mrs. Callahan watched with pride as Jeremy stood beside the director, his face beaming with a mix of pride and wonder. The other children from St. Anne's clapped and cheered, their voices filling the air with a joyful energy that seemed to wash away the lingering shadows of that dark day. For the first time, the sanctuary felt like a place of true learning and discovery, a place where children could feel safe and valued. As they made their way back to the bus after the ceremony, Jeremy turned to Mrs. Callahan, his face alight with a newfound confidence. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," he said softly, "for believing in me, for making sure they listened." Mrs. Callahan smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You did this, Jeremy. You're the reason things changed." With a final glance at the sanctuary, Jeremy boarded the bus, his head held high. The sanctuary had become a different place, a place of growth and healing, and for the children of St. Anne's, it symbolized the power of resilience, the strength to confront injustice, and the knowledge that their voices mattered. As the bus pulled away, Mrs. Callahan looked out the window, a sense of peace settling over her. She knew that the journey had been difficult, but it had also been worth every struggle. She had fought for justice, for accountability, and for a safer future for the children she cared for. And in the end, she had found something even more powerful, a community united, a young boy's courage recognized, and a sanctuary transformed. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe so you don't miss our next stories, and don't forget to check out the channel for more videos. Leave comments. We value your opinion.